Congratulations. Uh, Someone won't have some comment or intervention or question? Please, please. So, James.
Thank you. One of the things that I worry about was raised in the previous talk and in yours that I think emphasizes why it is important to vaccinate children. I've always thought that the brain has built into it a timetable for learning. If you deprive children of education during that timetable, it's very hard, maybe even impossible, to make it up. And so it would seem to me that one of the really essential reasons to vaccinate children is so they can go back to school. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, kids getting infected disrupts their education. Some kids recover quickly, but many, it may take quite a period of time. Those learning losses are on top of the learning losses they've already suffered. So I'm happy to add that to yet one more important reason why children need to be vaccinated. And I think certainly loss of learning would be one of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the Dean for the very important comments and the reminder of the importance of vaccinating children, not just the routine vaccinations, which we see across the globe have suffered during the times of the pandemic, but also the important plea to make sure that children are vaccinated against COVID. Just wanted to mention that UNICEF's next State of the World's Children will be on vaccinations. So comments are very well received. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your important paper. And I'm reflecting a little bit on the last paper as well as yours. And one of the take-home messages for me for the last paper was the importance of caregivers as a lever of change, if we think about that framing. And what we are when we think about caregivers, we typically think of parents, daycare, and educators. But I think if we want to take a culturally relevant framing, extended kin is actually the reality of caregiver, especially for younger children. That isn't always worked into our public policy mechanisms. And yet I think it's actually where a lot of our work might be. And I'm wondering if you can, if you agree, and if you can think of ways that we might be able to support extended caregivers in better ways as we try to help our children moving forward.
It's a fabulous point, and I will say just a couple of things about it. One is we do have this very narrow view when it comes to policy to thinking about caregivers as immediate family, mom, dad, the school teacher or the early childhood caregiver. But of course, that's not the reality for most of the world. And I even think about in my own early childhood growing up in India, of course, my parents were very instrumental, but so were my aunts and uncles and my grandparents. And that is not a mindset that I think gets appreciated. And so when we think about, for instance, the impact of this pandemic on the elderly and think about loss of caregivers, we don't count the fact that so many older people have passed away. That, of course, is tragic and awful unto itself, but the impact of that on children, on the grandkids, is something that's never discussed. But of course, it is very profound as well. So I very much appreciate your point, and I think any policy strategy that focuses on children, that fails to account for the value of those relationships, the impact of that relationship, I think is really missing the bigger picture.
Sad. It's true for the developing world, but if you think about the so-called post-developing world, postmodern, the immigrant communities, it's very true of immigrant communities. The extended kin is the caretaking network. Thank you.
I have a question. In this situation where it's clear the sufferings, the idea of the sufferings and the reality of the sufferings in others, but also in children, because of COVID, and because we say all day people to death. What kind of explanation we can say about the sufferings to the children? Because this is, I think, the education of the sufferings is one of the more important things in this moment.
Yeah. This has been a source of some frustration for, I think, many of us who've been closely following this pandemic. There has been a minimization of the impact of the pandemic on children. One of the reasons I was thrilled that we are hosting these 2 days is that children have largely been ignored and the suffering that they have gone through. And of course, the mental health effects, the familial effects, but their own direct health effects of the infection has been consistently minimized by many to suggest somehow it doesn't matter. And I will make one point on this that feels important to me, which is that we often compare these things by saying, well, children are at lower risk than adults or than older elderly. That's the wrong framework. Children are always at lower risk than the elderly for almost everything. The right framework is, how does COVID compare to other risks that children face? And in that light, COVID is actually quite a serious health condition. And that is the right framing. I have children, I have elderly parents. I never ask, well, is this as big a deal for my kids as it is for my parents? I ask, how does this compare to other risks that my children face that I am responsible for helping to minimize? And in that context, this is a very important issue. And so I can think of no more important of a body than this, and the Pontifical Academy raising this issue and saying that we cannot ignore and minimize the impact, the direct impact on the health of children. So thank you for hosting this.
Very, very much. There are another person that want to ask you is our new academician, Pearl, in Zoom. So, Pearl, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I just wanted to make a comment which may be responded to, relating to both this presentation and the previous one, in terms of care and the family in particular, because there's a big emphasis on family, that perhaps we need a way of developing a kind of mainstreaming of care back to the community as well. I understand the importance of the institutions. I understand the importance of policy. But given the kind of family that is there in the 21st century, the kind of family full of migrant workers, it's in Africa especially, that has been the status of affairs for a very long time. It is a kind of family that has makeshift arrangements for parenting. By the time the person is taken to an institution, even if it's an early childhood institution, they're not even living with their parents. And so I worry about whether we do have basic messages for the family, that we can find points of engagements with adults, whether it is in a church or Stockfells or wherever, just basic things to look out for in the life of a child that must be mainstreamed back to community rather than waiting for an institution to take over. That's just my contribution for now. Thank you very much.
Just a quick response to say thank you for that very important comment. And you're absolutely right. And really builds in some ways to what we heard earlier about the role of the extended family and the kin. Again, this mental model of somehow children care is all about the two parents. Of course, we know that's not the right framework. And so 2 points. I mean, one is broadening it to the community is absolutely essential. To quote the old line, it takes a village, and it really does. And in many places in the world, and not just in low and middle income countries, but in high income countries, there's a communal responsibility for raising children that doesn't supersede parental roles, but in fact supplements and adds to it. And so helping identify those issues is a really critical part of any strategy that thinks about optimizing health for children.
There are more questions. We can go to in the program we have this moment, the general discussion. Maybe we can open the general discussion. There are some general questions. We open the general discussion, maybe about all the paper of this morning. All the things that you want to put in the table.
I take the opportunity, since it was quiet, to come back on one issue in relation to children in institutional care and children on the move. I know we'll be speaking a lot more to these important issues later on, particularly in relation to immigrants and refugees and children who are forcibly or not so forcibly on the move. But in relation to health and in relation to vaccinations, and also in relation maybe to the earlier issues raised in relation to psychosocial support for children, I was wondering if previous speakers would like to come in and make a few more comments around these issues. Thank you.
Well, let me make maybe just one quick one, and because there's a lot more expertise among others here around this issue. Of course, we've seen a greater displacement of humanity now, and certainly before the pandemic, than at any point since the end of World War II. And that means when you have that level of displacement, it's of course children along with their families. I think this is a very important area for public health to really begin to both systematically collect data, understand the health effects. Obviously, those are children who need all of the basic services of vaccinations, but the immigration, the movement creates a whole set of additional health risks that I believe we largely do not understand. We need to understand it better, and then we need to figure out what we need to do. And again, I'm not going to say more because there are literally people here who are the world's experts on that topic, but it has struck me as a broader public health expert to say this is an important area that has gotten too little attention.
I have a question for Dr. Yousafzai, who is on Zoom. Is she still with us, or did she go to sleep? Which I would certainly understand. She's still here? Oh, good. You mentioned that most NGO, civil society interventions for children tend to be short-term, project-based with limited outreach. Thank you for that. And I wonder, do you have an example? Could you tell us more about an intervention that you admire, that you think has had successful consequences? I would like to hear more about that.
Yeah. Sorry. I think there are some good examples that we can learn from. The first I would point to is the Chile Crece Contigo program, which is at scale. And I think some of the features of its success, first of all, is high level of government leadership, which means that the program is accountable for its delivery. I think it also is another feature of success there is the coordination and the streamlining across three sectors. So the health sector, the education sector, and the social protection sector. And thirdly, it has a combination of both universal programming that supports young children and caregivers, but it also has targeted programs for children at risk, and they have attended to ensuring referral systems for children who have additional needs are strengthened. Another example is the child development centers in Bangladesh, which again, in common with Chile, have the high level of government leadership. But this is one of the few examples where children with disabilities have been included in a very inclusive early childhood development approach. And they have tackled the issue of workforce shortage in early childhood by training a new cadre known as developmental therapists. And this points to a comment that Ashish made earlier, which is that many interventions don't need to rely on highly specialized psychologists, psychiatrists, but lay workers can be trained. And this is where the developmental therapists have emerged from, a model where they've been trained by a range of specialists to be this community-based intervention worker for young children with disabilities. So I think there are promising examples where we can tease out their features of success. I think we need to be able to look at how that implementation can happen across different cultural settings around the world.
Thank you. There are some other questions? Please.
All of the effects that we're talking about measuring today, I'm reminded of my 105-year-old mother-in-law who passed away 2 years ago. And she had the 1918 flu when she was a child. And it's one of her earliest memories of being separated from her parents because she was in the hospital, and of cousins who died from it. And I'm thinking about what we know about children's development and the ages at which they live through things and what they understand and what they remember, and also what physiologically affects them. So I guess I'm just making a plea that we need to both focus on the short-term responses, but these are things which will define, as we're talking about a COVID generation, it will define people into old age. They will be experiencing both physical effects, which we don't know. I mean, shingles is the reminder of the disease you had as a baby. We don't know what this will do to people going forward. The food insecurity, which is really very pronounced among immigrant communities in the United States, how that affects children's development. And so I really think we as scholars have a very big responsibility to launch some longitudinal studies and to take ones that have been in the field and think very carefully about the kinds of questions we need to ask so that we can understand how this unfolds across the life course, because I think this is something that will have a very lasting effect.
Please.
But maybe building on that, one of the things we have learned over the last decade, certainly, is that early stresses, early exposures have lifelong effects. And so what happens in utero, for instance, and the stress that the mother has, or environmental exposures during while she's pregnant, has profound effects on cardiovascular disease for that child than when that person becomes an adult 50 years later. Understanding all of that is an area, obviously, that requires a lot more work, but then it also becomes a very important model to understand, like the kids who've been born in the last 2 years during the pandemic, children who have gotten COVID and recovered, like what are the long-term effects? And these are studies that we need to get, as you said, get going on now. But all of the new knowledge that we've gained in the last 10, 15 years suggests that these are going to be long-term issues we're going to be dealing with. So I'm really grateful for that comment, and I think it really requires a lot of work.
Marcelo. Thank you. So, Ashish, I wonder if you could reflect upon, in a Cartesian binary, we can think in terms of the synchronic effects of the pandemic, the research that we presented this morning. How is it unfolding in various parts of the world? We can also think in terms of the diachronic framework, and that is inspired by Mary's question. I wonder if you could share with us the lessons flowing from previous pandemics. And there are so many domains here. I mean, clearly there are issues that are very connected with the unique biological features of the virus. But I wonder if you could talk about previous pandemics. Polio was defeated. Salk and Sabin got us there. My intuition is that we live in a very different world today. So that's the question regarding the vaccines, not as biomedical vehicles, but also the social life of the vaccine. I wonder if you could comment on those issues.
Yeah, you raised several really important questions there, Marcelo, and let me see if I can maybe make a few comments in response. One is that the sort of peri-pandemic and post-pandemic time period in the few years that follow the acute phase of a pandemic are very, very important for long-term profound changes. We saw coming out of the 1918 flu pandemic, I would argue, was the basis for why there was this movement towards universal health coverage in many European countries in the years that followed. So social movements that move slowly or hard, they face resistance, all of a sudden can accelerate after a pandemic because there is a time period in which much greater change feels possible. But that change, not all change is good. Whether the change is good or bad is really up to us. So I think we should think about that in terms of the next few years. And if we're thinking today and tomorrow, particularly about children, asking some of the bigger questions about what are the ways in which we need societal change, policy change, attitude changes about children, there may be a lot more possible in the upcoming years than we would have expected pre-pandemic. It's one of the few upsides of a health crisis. To your question around polio vaccines, no question, polio terrified generations of people. And indeed, the vaccine was such a savior. And again, the biomedical part of it is important, of course, but psychologically and socially, it became this incredible symbol of medical progress and our ability to take something terrifying and eliminate it. And I think I am deeply worried about how the current state of polarization and politicization of the COVID vaccine has the risk of turning that backward. And I raise this very specific example from the United States. We were all gathered here 3 years ago, and we were talking about vaccination of children in the United States. I would have said the model that we all should emulate is the state of Mississippi. The state of Mississippi has the highest vaccination rate of any state in America because it was mandatory. There were no exceptions. There were no religious exemptions. You had to get vaccinated if you were a child and wanted to go to school. It was phenomenal. Mississippi is now not only blocking COVID vaccinations for kids, it is considering turning back all of those regulations and making all vaccinations voluntary for school-age kids. So now I potentially can send my child to school in Mississippi without their polio vaccine. This is a profound issue, not just for children's health, which of course it is, but a breakdown of social compact and a questioning of the progress that we have made in medical science. And the spillover of that will go well beyond vaccines. So I worry immensely about the age we're entering, and it really behooves all of us to work harder to counter the negative forces that may emerge from this pandemic.
Thank you, Ashish. Those of you who don't live in the United States should know that Ashish is the voice of reason, the conscience of the medical and scientific approach to the pandemic, and has done more good in national television and radio than I think any other person in the United States. Jeff.
Thank you. Well, I was going to say a similar thing to Ashish's second remark, because at first he expressed optimism that we would push forward. Our global response to this pandemic has been a shocking disaster, getting worse. And I will try not to cascade into complete despair, but we have, on best estimates, 16 million people dead worldwide, and numbers are rising, and we've decided that the pandemic is over. And the main fact of the pandemic is that it has divided society. It has not united society. There are no reflections on anything that we're talking about on a broader scale. It's over, we can get back to life, and everything's fine, except we may also be sliding to world war today. So we are not in a situation where we are experiencing any remote social reflection on anything that has happened. And the antisocial responses at all scales and all levels are profound. So I think this is our backdrop. And I like the fact that we have three groups here which have deep cultures, the deepest being our host institution. The second culture is the culture of New England. And the third culture is the culture of the UN. We are so different from the world right now. I can't even stress. There is no possibility of focusing on the development agenda, education. We're now in war for years to come, whether it's hot war or cold war. Everything is now going to be about a different subject, because if we go, as the State Department just said hours ago, that if China continues to cooperate with Russia, then we will impose sanctions on China. You can believe there is no end to this. And the idea that the world says, oh my, we had a crisis and now we had a catastrophe, now we really have to focus on the children, don't count on it. Not from governments. I don't know whether governments will destroy us all, because our politicians are the worst. And I don't know how we can escape from that, but I would say the ethics of the three groups that I identified here are what's needed to salvage things. But I have no confidence at all in the US government saying any coherent thing, because it hasn't through two administrations. It won't. Now we're at war. The logic every hour is escalation. And we're in a bad way. And the pandemic had no psychological effect except derangement. It had no effect on the human side at all. Maybe because I read the Wall Street Journal, which is, I don't know what the penance is for. But every day it is, we must get back to the economy. We must get back to the economy. There's not a moment about the children, about society, about the suffering, about the deaths, about the risks, nothing. It's entirely about who is in power, who's in charge, who's making billions. It has nothing to do with anything. So we should strategize about that, but we should understand that the cultures we represent are completely different from the cultures in the world right now. And Ashish's illustration of Mississippi is a phenomenally interesting one. Phenomenally interesting. I thought I misheard him for a moment when he said highest vaccination rate, because I had turned aside for a moment and he was referring to polio and children's immunizations, because it's the lowest now, essentially, with the current. And if they could go to zero, they would. And the two leading candidates at CPAC yesterday were Donald Trump and DeSantis, two monsters of human beings. I'm sorry to put it that way, but I will. But actually, we shouldn't get into dehumanization. They're just bad people. And that's what we're facing. And it's very, very dangerous and getting worse. I'm sorry to say it, but I just wanted to underscore what Ashish has emphasized.
Well, that is sobering and hard to follow. And my comment was a version of what you were saying, but not at the level of war, which makes perfect sense to me, Jeffrey. But my point was, most of my life I have worked on early childhood education. That's been my research, showing that it works, showing that it matters, and there is research that other people have done, like, economists showing the return on investment during the early years is like 7 times the effect of the investment later on. And so my point was going to be, but nothing has happened in the United States, nothing at all. I know a little bit about what happened in Chile, actually, because there was political will. There's a Harvard Rockefeller Center in Chile. I went down when I was dean of the School of Education with a number of other researchers, and a team helped them, and there was an evaluation, but the political will was there already. And it's getting harder and harder for there to be any kind of political will whatsoever for anything. I mean, we're seeing a Supreme Court justice being blocked because she went to Harvard, right? That's the criticism, that she went to Harvard. So I do think that the question that you're raising is a really important one, because I'm interpreting it, well, we can talk about the severity of it, which I really heard you say, but the basic problem is that that there's a disconnect between the research we do and the policies and practices that happen, unless there's an accident, as in Chile, and I'm guessing in Mississippi during the good days, somebody had a good idea, and now vaccinations have been politicized, so they're going to go away. I mean, politics trumps research, politics trumps, sensibility, and it would be good for us to take some time to think about that here and maybe beyond. How do we take some of the good research we're doing and make a difference in the lives of children? We maybe have a shot with children because the world loves children, and there's no culture that loves children more than Italy. This much I know. This is true. There's so much more I could say, but thank you, Jeffrey, for your comments.
If I may, Kathy. Go ahead.
Yes, a very quick follow-up to what Jeff just said. No, you are right, Jeff. I agree totally with you. But the fact that our politicians and in general politics is misbehaving. But the real question is, why is that so? because it was not like that until the 70s of last century. So we have to inquire. My point is that politics is no longer politics in the Greek sense of the word, because who are listening to our politicians, our prime minister? We know. And that is the reason why in chapter 5 of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis, what does he wrote? He did wrote the following: unless politics gets rid of economics and bad interest, there is nothing to be done. And that is obvious. Because so unless we change the economic culture, it is obvious that the politicians are becoming more and more slaves of what that is the reason why we observe today a void of thinking thought. As we know, there are two types of thought: calculating thought and thinking thought. Now, we have no longer a thinking thought. We have only calculating thought. And that is the reason why, for instance, places like this academy and many other places are trying to put a resistance, producing a new thought, because it is obvious that the cultural matrix, which is today dominating, is strong in terms of the facts, but it's very weak in terms of substance, because it's very easy to put them to the side, because they understand nothing. They have no basis. They have only the power. So that is why the reaction is to produce a new thought, because I believe that. So that is the reason why chapter 5 of Fratelli Tutti is the most quoted part of that encyclical, because the other parts were more or less already known. But the novelty of that encyclical is in chapter 5, where he says politics should go back to the original meaning of, which means the common good.
Could I make a question, please? Ashish, I'm trying to understand why the masses of people in the United States are refusing vaccinations. At a deep level, on a political level, I understand it's polarized, it's anti-science, anti-elite, anti-Harvard, pro-Trump, although it gets more confusing than that fast. But are you familiar with the ghost dance of indigenous people in the United States when they were faced with complete destruction of their cultures, communities, and it was pretty much over? And they cast off armor, 100-pound bows, and they danced in front of colonists with guns. Now, sometimes this feels like that to me at a deep level, and I share your oscillation, Jeff, between a shard of hope and utter despair and rage completely. But it feels like that to me, like there's a suicidality to the mass dissociation and amnesia in the people. I mean, forget the monster politicians for 1 second. I freak out at how many people are believing this. People that I thought were rational, but appear not to be. Could you speak about that, please?
Absolutely. And maybe this is why I have less despair and more hope. So the complexity of the moment is really, in my mind, driven by the fact that we live in these information ecosystems that are self-reinforcing. And so let me lay out the problem, but then I'll tell you why I remain somewhat hopeful. I know a lot of people, not a lot, but some people certainly, who refuse to get vaccinated. And if I speak to them, they are good people, they are rational, they are smart, they believe in science. And everything that they have heard and everything that they understand about the world suggests that these vaccines are terrible and they're killing millions of people. And they look at me with sympathy and think I am confused and that I have been brainwashed and say, you know, I know you're trying, but you're wrong. It's an important point in that it's not about bad people, it's not about dumb people. And so then the question is, how did we get to a point where people have such different information ecosystems that they live in? And almost more importantly, what do we do about it? And that second part is, I think, actually the challenge. And by the way, you brought it up in the context of vaccines. We can talk about that in the context of politics, democracy, and climate change, that people have deeply held beliefs based on what I think is misinformation and disinformation. And we have not yet begun to really figure out how do we bridge that gap. And to me, that's the most important issue of our time, is how do we, you know, in the past, we had a common book of facts and we could disagree on the interpretation and analysis. Now everybody gets to have their own facts. And that's a whole different level of challenge. So then why do I have any hope at all? Because I do believe there are ways of bridging those gaps. I do believe there are ways of engaging with people who live in different information ecosystems. There is more and more evidence and new tools are being developed to help inoculate people against misinformation. I think these are things that we can do. So I look at the current situation, don't get me wrong, I have been out there every day, 30 times a day, telling people to get vaccinated for a year and a half. A little frustrating when I have to stand up and say people really ought to get vaccinated. So I don't minimize the challenge in front of us, but at the same time, I am hopeful that we can develop the tools to counter these things. And when we do, then we can actually help politicians make better decisions. They are responding to the incentives in front of them. DeSantis is responding to the incentives around him that knows that his chances of becoming president are much greater if he takes certain strategies. He wants to be president, so that's why he's doing it. We can talk about the morals of that, but that's what he's doing. We've got to change the incentives for politicians.
Sorry, we need to go to take coffee break. So there are two more people that want to ask. Pierre and Sebastian Dipina, our academicians, are in Zoom, but we can do this in the next general discussion because we need to conserve exactly the timetable. In the contrary, we don't have time for the conference. Thank you very much and congratulations.